This is ibsportstv.com. I'm BJ Griffin. Upcoming Strikeforce event, Dan Henderson versus Fedor Emelianenko. Very, very exciting fights lined up on the Strikeforce fight card. And the most interesting of all the fights, in my opinion, is the main event, Fedor Emelianenko versus Dan Henderson. Very tough fight to pick, which is why I'm not gonna pick it. You all are gonna pick it. Sign up for ibsportstv.com and pick all the fights for this Strikeforce event, Dan Henderson versus Fedor Emelianenko, and I will announce the leaders after the fight. Now I'm gonna get into it a little bit. Dan Henderson versus Fedor Emelianenko. Now Dan Henderson's last loss was to Jake Shields, and his last fight was a win over Rafael Cavalcante via third round TKO. Now, Fedor Emelianenko is coming off of 2 losses, one to Antonio Bigfoot Silva and one to Fabricio Werdum. Now, first of all, why this fight's so hard to pick is because we don't know how good Fedor is going to show up for this fight. His last 2 fights haven't been very characteristic of how we're used to seeing Fedor. Now, with that being said, I really feel like with the Fabricio Werdum fight, Fedor didn't just jump into his guard, that he would have had a great chance to win that fight. And of course, Antonio Bigfoot Silva, he just got beat down by Bigfoot Silva. Now, Dan Henderson has, these guys match up very well, and there's a lot of places where they're even now. Dan Henderson, both guys have a lot of power in the fist. Let me just get that out of the way. But Dan Henderson has that big overhand right, and Fedor probably throws a few more haymakers than Dan Henderson does. Dan Henderson kind of likes to load up that right hand a little bit. Now, Dan Henderson is a great wrestler and will have a great chance to take down Fedor Emelianenko. But if Fedor gets taken down, it's not like Fedor's going to be helpless because of that great sambo background. And Fedor is real crafty on the ground. He sneaks in a lot of submissions. If you look at the Antonio Bigfoot Silva fight, as he was getting beat in the face, he went for a lot of submissions, and I feel like those submissions could work on a lot of people, Dan Henderson included. We've seen Dan Henderson try to wrestle in the past. A great example when he fought Anderson Silva. You see Dan Henderson try to wrestle in the past, and as he's using his wrestling, Anderson Silva worked in his jiu-jitsu and got that rear naked choke victory on Dan Henderson. So very possible that Dan Henderson could get submitted in this fight. So there's a lot of different ways that the fight could go. Very tough fight to pick. So we'll see what happens there and how many people can get that fight right. Now, another interesting fight on the fight card, Paul Daley versus Tyron Woodley. I'm a fan of how Paul Daley fights. I don't necessarily care for him as a person or his personality or whatever, but I'm a real big fan of the way he fights. His fight against Nick Diaz was extremely exciting. That only lasted for 1 round. But that being said, he's gonna have his hands full with Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley, a great grappler, a great wrestler, and Paul Daley with not the best takedown defense. So it's going to be interesting to see how that fight turns out. A lot of people picking Tyron Woodley in that fight. So we're just going to have to see what happens. So make sure to make your picks on ibsportstv.com. Sign up and pick the fights for the Strikeforce event, Fedor Emelianenko versus Dan Henderson. So make sure to subscribe, follow us on Twitter. This is ibsportstv.com. I'm BJ Griffin. If you leave a question in the comment box, I'll answer it on a video. It's ibsportstv.com. I'm BJ Griffin. Signing off.